The spare room had not held warmth in 3 years, not since Owen Hayes buried his wife in the frozen ground behind the barn, and he had long since stopped thinking of it as anything but a place to stack harness leather and broken tools. The morning Sharamph Ironblood collapsed against his fence post. He was not looking for anything to change. He was mending the split rail along the north pasture, his breath clouding in the October air, the ridge of the Coldthorn Mountains cutting a pale blue line against the sky behind his homestead. The land out here at the edge of the Ashvale frontier was the kind that broke men or made them hard, and Owen Hayes had been made hard enough by it that his neighbors sometimes forgot he had ever laughed at all. He was 31 years old, broad across the shoulders from years of hauling timber and working the plow, with dark hair going gray at the temples and a square jaw that had not seen a proper shave in a week. He was, in every way that mattered on the frontier, a man who minded his own business. And then the orc woman came around the bend in the wagon trail, and his business became considerably more complicated. She was not running, though she looked like she had been. She was walking with the kind of slow, deliberate care that a person uses when every step costs them something, her hand braced against the fence rail as she moved along it, her head down. She wore travel leathers that had clearly been made for fighting before they were repurposed for fleeing, a fitted bodice of deep brown leather, laced tight up the front with cord that had been retied unevenly, the kind of mending done by one's own hands in the dark. Her trousers were the same dark brown, tucked into boots that had seen 100 miles of hard ground, and a torn linen undershirt showed at the collar of the bodice where the leather did not reach. The whole outfit clung to her figure in the way only well-made leathers can, shaped to the body inside them, and the body inside them was tall and strong and unmistakably feminine despite the road dust, and the blood dried along her left temple. Her hair was black, thick, pulled back from her face in a heavy braid that had come half undone, and when she lifted her face to look at him, it was the face of a woman who was not afraid of him and was not asking for pity. She was simply, very quietly, out of options. Her tusks were small for an orc, the delicate lower pair that some clans prized, and her eyes were the color of dark amber, catching the pale morning light with something between wariness and exhausted pride. There was a bruise across her cheekbone and dried blood on her lip, and she looked at Owen Hayes the way a person looks at a stranger when they have nothing left to lose by looking. "I need water," she said. Her voice was low and clear, accented with the broad vowels of the Eastern Orc dialects. "I can pay for it." Owen set down his mallet. He had grown up in Ashvale. He had seen orc raiders when he was 12 years old torch 3 farms along the valley, and he had buried his neighbor Aldous Trent with his own hands after the raids. He carried all of that the way frontier men carried their history, in the set of his jaw, in the instinct that made his hand move toward the fence post as if it were a weapon. He felt all of that old reflex fire up in him, and then he looked at the blood on her temple and the careful, dignified way she held herself against the fence rail, and he told the reflex to be quiet. "I've got a well," he said. "Come through the gate." She studied him for a moment. Then she came through the gate. Her name came out in pieces over the course of that first hour, Sharamph, and then Ironblood, the clan name she gave with a kind of deliberate flatness, the way someone says a word they have learned to use as armor. She sat on the stump beside the well and drank 2 full ladles of water and said nothing else until the color came back to her face, and Owen leaned against the barn door and did not push her. He was not, by nature, a man who pushed. He found out, eventually, the broad shape of it. She had been exiled from Clan Ironblood 3 months ago, accused of speaking against the chief's war council speaking truth, by her account, and the account was told quietly and without self-pity, which made him believe it more than if she had wept. She had been traveling west since then, following the frontier road, trying to reach the free territories where mixed settlements had taken root, and a person could work for wages without being driven off by a mob. She had made it as far as the last town, Hestwick, which was 12 miles back down the road, And in Hestwick someone had decided her kind were not welcome and made that clear with fists and a thrown lantern. "The boarding house," she said. "I had paid for a room. The owner gave the money back, said he could not have the town angry at him." Owen said nothing. He had been to Hestwick enough times to know exactly which men she was describing. "You can clean up at the pump," he said, "and if you're hungry there's bread from this morning." She looked at him. There was the wariness again, that amber gaze measuring something about him she was not yet sure of. "Why?" "Because you're hungry," he said, "and because I have bread." It was not eloquent, but it was honest, and she seemed to understand that the honesty was the point. He fed her bread and cold salt pork, and she ate with careful, measured bites that told him she had been rationing herself for days. He put more on the plate when she finished, and she looked at the plate, and then at him, and then she ate that too. He found himself watching her hands, large and strong, green gold in the morning light, with the kind of calluses that came from real work rather than decoration, and he thought that whatever else she was not a person who had lived softly. The problem arose naturally, the way real problems do, without drama or announcement. The frontier road west did not run again until the weekly supply wagon came through in 4 days, and Sharamph Ironblood had no horse and no coin left for passage, and nowhere in Hestwick that would take her. She said all of this calmly, as if she were reporting weather, and Owen sat across the kitchen table from her and thought about the spare room at the end of the hall. It had a bed in it. It had a quilt his wife had made. It had a window that looked out on the north meadow and a door that latched from the inside. "There's a room," he said, "at the end of the hall. It doesn't get used." She stared at him. "4 days," he said, "until the wagon. You'd have your own door. I'd keep to my side of the house. You would let an orc sleep in your house," she said. It was not quite a question and not quite a statement. It was the kind of sentence a person says when they are trying to locate a trap. "I'd let a person sleep in my house," he said. "A person who needs a bed." She was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the wind came down off the Coldthorn Ridge and moved through the dry grass of the pasture, and the old house settled around them with its familiar creaks. Owen waited. He was good at waiting. "I will not be Charity," she said at last. "Then you can fix the section of fence along the east meadow," he said. "I've been meaning to get to it for a month and haven't. That'll square it." Another silence. And then, slowly, something in the set of her jaw shifted, not softening exactly, but something releasing, the way a knotted rope releases when the tension goes out of it. "Show me the fence," she said. He showed her the fence. She was, as it turned out, extremely good at mending fence. She worked alongside him through the afternoon, with the same quiet efficiency she seemed to apply to everything, learning his method within the first hour, and then improving on it, bracing the posts in a way that better accounted for the frost heave this far north. Owen watched her work and felt something stir in him that he had not expected, not attraction, not yet, but a kind of recognition. The recognition of a person who knew how to do difficult things without making a production of it. They worked until the light went gold and the shadows stretched long across the meadow, and when they came back to the house he made stew and she set the table without being asked, finding the bowls and the spoons with the quiet confidence of someone who had always known where things were kept. It was a small thing. It made the house feel different, fuller somehow, less like the kind of silence that echoes. She slept in the spare room that night, the door latched, and Owen lay in his own bed and stared at the ceiling and thought about nothing in particular for a long time before he finally slept. In the morning she was already up when he came down, the fire in the kitchen stove lit, and a pot of something grain-based simmering in the way that suggested she had gone through his dry stores and made something from whatever she found. She set a bowl in front of him without comment. "You cook," he said. "I do many things," she said, and sat across from him and ate her own bowl. He almost smiled. He was not sure he had almost smiled in a long time. The 4 days passed, and then they passed again, because on the morning the supply wagon was due to come through, Owen found himself at the kitchen table saying something he had not planned to say. "You mentioned the free territories," he said. She looked up from her bowl. "That's another 140 miles west," he said. Hard road and winter's coming. I am aware, she said. There's work here, he said. Real work, not charity. The east field needs to be broken before the ground freezes, and I've got firewood to cut and split, and a roof section on the barn that needs replanking before the snow comes. It's 2 months of work at least. She was very still. You'd have the room, he said, and wages, honest wages. Your neighbors, she said slowly. What will they say? My nearest neighbor is 4 miles east, he said. Tom Birch, he's a reasonable man. The ones in Hestwick are 12 miles. I don't owe them my business. People will come to the farm, she said. They will see me. Let them. She looked at him for a long moment with those amber eyes, and he met her gaze steadily, because he was not ashamed of the offer and he wanted her to know that. 2 months, she said, and then I go west. 2 months, he agreed. She stayed 2 months, and then winter arrived in earnest, and the road west became a wall of ice and wind, and she stayed through that too. The first time the town came to the farm, it was the butcher's boy from Hestwick, a red-faced young man named Corvin, who had ridden out to deliver a ham Owen had ordered 2 weeks prior, and who had not expected to find an orc woman replanking the barn roof. Owen was below her, handing up shingles, and he heard the horse stop and turned to find Corvin staring up at Sharamph with an expression somewhere between shock and something uglier. That's Corvin started. That's my hired hand, Owen said. The ham, please. Corvin looked at him. Then he looked back up at Sharamph, who was nailing a shingle with the focused precision she brought to everything and had not looked down once. Then he handed over the ham, took the coin Owen offered, and rode back toward Hestwick without another word. Owen looked up at the roof. You can say thank you, Sharamph said without looking down. You're welcome, he said, and handed up the next shingle. This, he realized later, was when something began to shift. It was not one moment. It was the accumulation of small ones, the way sediment builds into stone over time. It was the way she handed him the axe handle first every time, which nobody had ever done. It was the way she always checked whether he had eaten before she ate, which she did without comment or expectation of notice, just a quiet turn of her head toward the kitchen before she sat down. It was the way she laughed the first time she caught him arguing with a stubborn fence post, a real laugh, sudden and bright, that came from somewhere genuine and surprised them both. He was not looking for it. That was the thing. He was not looking for it, and it found him anyway. By December, they had fallen into a rhythm that felt so natural he had stopped noticing it, which was itself a kind of noticing. She cooked on the mornings he had early work to do. He cooked on the mornings she had split wood to bring in. They ate together at the kitchen table with the lamp burning between them against the short winter days, and sometimes they talked and sometimes they did not. And the silence was the kind that meant something good rather than something empty. She told him about the clan gradually, in the way that people tell hard things in pieces, when the moment allows it. The Ironbloods were a war clan, old and proud, nested in the eastern ranges where 3 river valleys met. Her mother had been a healer, which was an unusual thing in a war clan, and Sharamph had grown up between those 2 worlds, the warrior's world of her father and brothers and the healer's world of her mother, never entirely at home in either. When the chief called the war council to plan raids south into the human settlements along the Ashvale road, she had stood up in the council tent and said that this was wrong, that the settlements had done nothing to them, that the raids were greed dressed as honor. They did not exile me that night, she said. They waited 3 days to let me think I had maybe been forgiven. Then they exiled me. The waiting was meant to be crueler, Owen said. Yes, she said. The chief understood cruelty very well. He thought about his neighbor Aldous Trent, dead 20 years ago in a raid. He thought about the 12-year-old boy he had been, standing in the field with smoke on the horizon. He thought about Sharamph standing in a council tent saying this is wrong, knowing what it would cost her. I'm glad you said it, he said. She looked at him across the lamp. Even though the raids, she started. I know what the raids did, he said. I know it. And you stood up in that tent and said it was wrong and they threw you out into the cold for it. Those 2 things are both true. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You are a very strange man, Owen Hayes." "I've been told," he said, and she laughed again, quieter this time, warmer. The snow came in full force the second week of December, and the world contracted to the farm and the barn and the space between them, and Owen found that this contraction did not feel like a hardship. He found her one evening in the spare room. She had left the door slightly open, which she had never done before, and when he passed in the hall he saw her sitting on the edge of the bed with something in her hands. He stopped, because he was not sure she knew he was there, and then he saw what she was holding. It was the quilt. His wife's quilt, the one with the blue and yellow squares, which he had not moved from the room because he had not known what else to do with it. Sharamph was not looking at it the way a person admires something. She was holding it across her lap with both hands flat on the fabric, gently, the way you hold something that belongs to someone else and you want to be careful with it. He must have made some sound because she looked up quickly, and for a moment there was something unguarded in her face, not embarrassment exactly, but something soft and caught. "I am sorry," she said. "I should have asked." "No," he said. "It's all right. Whose was it?" He leaned his shoulder against the doorframe. "My wife's, Clara. She made it the second winter we were here. Said she needed something to do with her hands when the dark came early." Sharamph looked back down at the quilt. She was skilled. "She was skilled at most things," he said. "She died 3 years ago, fever, spring of 47. I am sorry." "So am I," he said. "Every day a little." A pause. The fire popped in the stove down the hall. "You keep the room as it was," she said. "I kept the room," he agreed. "I didn't know how else to." He stopped. "I didn't know what else to do with it." She looked up at him then, and there was such careful attention in her gaze, the kind of looking that is also a kind of listening, that he felt it like a hand on his chest. "You can use the quilt," he said. "It was made to be used. Clara would have hated knowing it was just sitting." Sharamph pressed her palms flat against the quilt one more time, and then she smoothed it carefully over the bed and stood up. "I think she would have liked knowing someone was keeping warm with it," she said. "I think so too," he said. She met his eyes, and he held her gaze, and the hallway was very quiet and very warm. And then she said good night, and he said good night, and he went to bed and lay awake for a long time thinking about the way she had held the quilt in both her hands. January was brutal, the way frontier winters always were, the kind of cold that turned breath to ice crystals and made the barn animals restless and kept the roads impassable for weeks at a stretch. They were together nearly every hour of every day because the farm demanded it: wood to split and carry, water to break ice from and haul, animals to feed and check on morning and evening, the endless maintenance of warmth against the cold outside the walls. Owen had never spent a winter this closely alongside another person, not since Clara, and the adjustment had surprised him. Not because it was hard, because it was not. There was a night in late January when the temperature dropped so low that the inside of the windows frosted over despite the fire, and he found her awake when he came down to stoke the stove at 2 in the morning, standing at the kitchen window in her undershirt and the thick wool blanket she had added to the quilt weeks ago, looking out at the white dark beyond the glass. "Could not sleep," he said. "The cold woke me," she said. "In the East Ranges, the winter camps are, there is a sound when it gets very cold. The trees crack, like a shot. I heard it just now from the tree line and could not remember where I was." He understood that kind of forgetting, the half-waking kind, when you reach for something or someone who is gone, and for a moment believe they are still there. He crossed to the stove and opened it and fed in 2 more logs, and the heat rose immediately, and he pulled the second kitchen chair close to the stove. "Come sit," he said. She came and sat, and he sat beside her, and they watched the fire through the slotted grate in silence. The cold outside pressed at the walls. Inside, the stove ticked and breathed. She had the blanket around her shoulders, and he had pulled his own from the back of the chair where he kept it for exactly these vigils. And at some point in the quiet, he became aware that her shoulder was against his arm because they had both leaned toward the heat, and neither of them moved away from it. "Tell me about Clara," she said, and her voice was soft, the way you speak in the dark when you are not afraid of the answer. He told her. He told her about Clara Morse, who had come from Hestwick with her family's wagon and had looked at the homestead Owen was building and said it needs a porch, and he had said I know, and she had said then build one, and he had, and she had been right. He told her about the first winter, about the porch they built together in the fall of the second year, about how Clara had died on a Tuesday in April while the crocuses were coming up through the last of the snow, and how he had sat beside her all that night and not been able to say anything useful, only hold her hand, and how he had thought for a long time afterward that he should have found better words. She knew, Sharamph said. How do you know that? Because she let you hold her hand, she said. If the words had not been enough, she would have needed more. He looked at her. In the firelight her face was warm, the green gold of her skin softened, the amber of her eyes deep and steady. That's, he stopped, started again. That's a kind thing to say. I mean it, she said simply. He believed her. That was the thing about Sharamph Ironblood, she did not say things she did not mean. It was not cruelty, it was precision. The kind of precision that made kindness, when it came, feel like something you could hold. He did not plan what happened next. He simply turned his head and looked at her, really looked at her, in the firelight, at 2 in the morning with the world frozen solid outside and the stove making the kitchen warm. And she turned her head and looked back at him, and the thing that had been building in him for weeks surfaced without ceremony or announcement. He reached up and touched the side of her face very gently, where the bruise had been when she first came, healed now, smooth, and she went very still, not pulling away but not yet moving toward him, just being still in the way something holds still when it is learning whether it is safe. Sharamph, he said, just her name, nothing else. And she leaned into his hand, the smallest lean, just the pressure of her temple against his palm, and he felt it move through him like a current. They did not kiss that night. He pulled his hand back gently, and she straightened, and they sat beside the stove a little longer and then went to their separate rooms, and he lay in the dark thinking about the small lean of her temple against his palm and felt, for the first time in 3 years, something that was not quite grief. He was not sure what it was yet. But it was not grief. February came, and with it a thaw just enough to open the road for a few days. And on one of those days Owen hitched the horse to the wagon and told Sharamph he was making a supply run into Hestwick and asked if she wanted anything. She was quiet for a moment and then said she would come, and he looked at her with what he hoped was a neutral expression and said all right. He knew what Hestwick would be. He had known it was coming. He had just hoped to have more time. They came into Hestwick on a Tuesday morning, with the road turning to mud under the wagon wheels, and the sky that particular shade of winter pale that meant the thaw was temporary. The market square was not full, winter keeping most people close, but there were enough people to notice. They always noticed. An orc woman on an Ashvale frontier wagon with a human man was the kind of thing that stopped people mid-sentence and turned heads with a jolt, the instinct of prejudice operating faster than thought. Owen drove the wagon into the square and set the brake and climbed down, and Sharamph climbed down on her side, and for a moment the square was just people looking. He had expected it. He moved to her side of the wagon and stood beside her, close enough to make a statement, and looked around the square with the flat, patient look of a man who has nowhere else to be and nothing to explain. The moment hung. Then people went back to their business, the way they always do when the moment does not give them what they were expecting. The trouble came from the blacksmith's shop, which Owen should have anticipated because the blacksmith in Hestwick was a broad red man named Horace Dent, who had lost a cousin in the Eastern raids 12 years back, and had made this fact the organizing principle of his personality. Horace came out of his shop with his leather apron still on and looked at Owen and then at Sharamph and said, loudly enough for the square to hear, that he would not serve any frontier man who brought that kind of business to town. The square went quiet again, the waiting kind. Owen stopped walking and turned around slowly. He was holding a sack of flour over one shoulder, which he set down on the wagon bed with a deliberate thud before he spoke. "Horace," he said, with great patience, "I have not asked you to serve me. I am at the general store. I am speaking to you as a citizen of this town, Horace said. He had come fully out into the square now, and 2 or 3 men who had been leaning outside the tavern had straightened up, the way men do when they think there might be something to see. "You are speaking," Owen said, loudly and to a man who has not addressed you. "You brought one of them here," Horace said. His voice had gone harder. "Into our market. After what they did to what who did," Owen said, and his voice was very quiet now, the quiet that was not calm so much as controlled. "To what, Horace?" "Name the specific person." Horace paused. He gestured at Sharamph. "Her," he said, "her kind." "Her name," Owen said, "is Sharamph Ironblood. She works my farm. She has done nothing to you or this town, and she will do her business here the same as any other person." He picked up the flour sack again. "And if you have something else to say, you can say it to my face and I will answer it. But if you are going to use the word kind like it is an argument, I do not have time for it." There was a pause that felt longer than it was. Owen did not look at Sharamph. He kept his eyes on Horace, and Horace looked at the flour sack and then at the 2 or 3 men by the tavern who had gone back to leaning, and then he made a sound of disgust and went back into his shop. Owen turned around and went to the general store. Inside, behind the counter, the storekeeper's wife, a small woman named Peg Hollies, watched Sharamph examine bolts of cloth with an expression that was cautious but not hostile. When Sharamph selected a length of dark wool and brought it to the counter and paid in coin, Peg took the coin and made the change without a word and then said, quietly, that the wool was a good choice for winter weight. Sharamph looked at her for a moment and then said, "Thank you." "You are welcome," Peg Hollies said, and that was that. On the ride back, the wagon loaded and the horses moving steady on the winter road, Owen looked at the mountains and Sharamph looked at the road ahead, and after a while she said, "You did not have to do that." "Yes, I did," he said. Another silence. "The cloth," she said. "I was going to make something for the room, a curtain perhaps." "The window needs it," he said. "The cold comes through the frame." "Yes," she said. "I noticed." He glanced at her. She was looking at the road, and there was a small thing happening at the corner of her mouth that was not quite a smile but was in the direction of one. "Sharamph," he said. "Owen," she said, in exactly the same tone. He almost laughed. He actually laughed, a short, surprised sound, and she did smile then properly, with her lower tusks catching the winter light, and it was the most beautiful thing he had seen in a very long time. The curtain she made was dark wool, hemmed neatly, hung on a rod she fashioned from a straight branch she found and smoothed. It made the spare room different. Warmer feeling, the way a room feels different when someone has put real care into it rather than just functioning within it. He noticed it when he passed the open door, which she left open more often now, and sometimes he stopped in the doorway and they talked, just the ordinary small talk of 2 people living alongside each other. What needs doing tomorrow, whether the east pasture fence held through the thaw, whether the goat was well or still off her feed. He began to understand that the small talk was how she trusted. She did not trust in dramatic declarations. She trusted in the accumulation of ordinary days, in the doing of things together, in the steady evidence that a person was what they appeared to be rather than what they were waiting to reveal. He could be patient with that. He had been patient with harder things. March brought mud and the first tentative warmth, and a return of the sounds of the world that winter had muffled, the creek running free again, the birds coming back to the tree line, the smell of the soil beginning to loosen. Owen started preparing the east field for spring planting and Sharamph worked alongside him, and there were days when the light was long and gold, and the work was hard but good, and the 2 of them moved around each other in the field with the unconscious ease of people who have learned each other's rhythms. He kissed her for the first time in the barn. He was not planning it. He had learned by now that planning was not how things happened with Sharamph Ironblood. Things happened the way seasons happened, by accumulation and readiness, and you did not plan the first warm day, you simply found yourself in it. She had climbed up to the loft to throw down hay and had missed her footing on the ladder coming back down. A small stumble, nothing serious, and he had caught her by the waist out of pure reflex, both hands at her sides, steadying her. She came down the last 2 rungs and turned to face him, and he was very close, his hand still at her waist, and she looked up at him. She was tall, nearly as tall as he was, and the looking up was only a small angle, and said in that precise, undecorated way she had, "Thank you." "Are you hurt?" he said. "No," she said. And then neither of them moved, because moving would have meant stepping back, and neither of them wanted to step back. He could feel the solid warmth of her through the leather of her bodice, and she was looking at him with those amber eyes, and her hands had come up and rested against his chest, not pushing, just resting, the way you rest your hands against something you are not sure about yet. "I want to kiss you," he said, because he was an honest man, and that was the honest thing. She was quiet for a moment. He waited. "Then do," she said. He did. He kissed her gently, the first kiss careful and brief, just the press of his lips to hers, and she kissed back with the same care. And when they parted, she looked at him very seriously for a moment, and then set her forehead against his. And he closed his eyes and stood there in the barn with the hay smell and the warm animal smell around them, and the early spring light coming through the gap in the boards. And he felt something settle in him that had been unsettled for 3 years. "Sharamph," he said against her forehead. "I know," she said quietly, as if she had been expecting this too, in the way you expect spring, not knowing exactly when, but knowing it is coming and being glad when it arrives. Spring on the frontier was no gentle season. There was planting and fencing and the constant work of a farm coming back to life after winter, and alongside the tenderness of what had opened between them, there was still the daily reality of hard work and hard land. But the work felt different now. The evenings felt different. The kitchen table felt different. He began finding small signs of her care throughout the house. A pot that had been scrubbed clean and hung on the proper nail. A cracked window frame she had chinked with fresh putty to stop the draft. A garden bed she had dug along the south wall of the house, and planted with the herb seeds she had been carrying in a cloth pouch since the eastern ranges. He did not comment on these things directly, because he understood that this was her language, the doing of small things as a form of saying larger ones, and he let her say them. He said his own things in the same language. A better axe handle fitted to her hatchet because the old one was wearing. A new wash basin in her room because the old one had a crack. Wildflowers from the creek bank left in a cup on the kitchen windowsill without explanation or ceremony. She found the flowers and looked at them for a long moment and did not say anything to him about it. But that evening she sat closer to him at the kitchen table than she usually did, and when the lamplight was low, she let her hand rest on top of his on the table, and he turned his hand over and held hers, and they sat like that for a long time. The second time Hestwick came to the farm, it was not as a single person or a small group. It was Horace Dent and 4 other men, riding up the farm lane on a Thursday afternoon in late April when the apple trees along the east fence were beginning to blossom. Owen saw them coming from the field and straightened up and set the plow handles down and waited. Sharamph was behind the barn. He could see her stop what she was doing and watch the riders come up the lane. Horace pulled up his horse 20 feet from Owen and looked down with the particular expression of a man who has worked himself into a grievance. "Hayes," he said, "we've come to speak to you about the situation." "The situation," Owen said. "The orc." Horace glanced toward the barn. "Words got around about you keeping her here. It's not right, Hayes. It's not decent, and some of us have talked it over and we think it needs to stop." Owen looked at the 5 men. He knew most of them. 2 he had drunk with in the tavern. 1 he had helped pull a wagon out of a ditch 2 winters ago. He recognized the faces, and he recognized something in them too, not malice exactly, but the thing that looks like malice, which is fear that has never been asked to look at itself honestly. "What exactly," Owen said slowly, "needs to stop?" "Her," Horace said. "She needs to go. We're not comfortable with Horace." Owen's voice was very quiet and very clear. "You rode 12 miles to tell me who lives in my house. It affects nothing that is yours," Owen said. "Not your land, not your stock, not your family. She works my farm and she lives under my roof and she has harmed no one, and what I choose to do on my own land with my own wages is not your concern or your decision." Horace's face had gone red. "There are children in this town who are in no danger from a woman fixing fence in Ashvale," Owen said. He stepped forward one step, not aggressive but deliberate. "I will say this once, Horace, all of you. You are standing on my property and you are not welcome to stand here and tell me how to run it. You can turn your horses around and go home, and we will all go on with our lives, or we can let this get complicated. I would prefer the first option." Behind Horace, one of the men Owen thought his name was Garvey, a farmer from the south end of the valley, shifted in his saddle and looked uncomfortable. "Horace," Garvey said quietly, "the man has a point." Horace stared at Owen for a long moment. The apple blossoms drifted in the warm April breeze between them, which was somewhat incongruous. Then Horace wheeled his horse around and rode back down the lane, and after a moment the others followed, Garvey last, who touched the brim of his hat at Owen as he turned. Owen held his ground until they were past the gate, and then he let out a long, slow breath. Sharamph came around the corner of the barn. She had been close enough to hear all of it. She stood and looked at him with those amber eyes and did not say anything for a moment. "Are you all right?" he said. "Are you?" she said. "Fine," he said. "You could have told them I would leave," she said. "It would have been easier." "Easier isn't the point," he said. She crossed the distance between them in a few long strides, and she put her hands on either side of his face, and she kissed him properly. Both of them standing in the apple blossom-drifted yard with the horses disappearing down the lane, and he put his arms around her and kissed her back. And when they broke apart, she looked at him and said, with the careful precision she gave to everything, "I love you." He had known it was coming, the way he had known the spring. He had felt it in every ordinary day, in the cup of wildflowers and the held hands, and the temple against his palm in the firelight. He had known it the way you know something you have been afraid to name, because naming it makes it real, and reality is the kind of thing you can lose. He held her face in both his hands, this remarkable woman who had walked to his fence post out of options and out of road and had stayed because the spare room needed curtains and the east field needed breaking, and because the world had been very unkind to her and he had not been. "I love you," he said. "I have loved you since January, if I'm being honest, but I was slow about recognizing it." She almost laughed. "You are a slow man, Owen Hayes." "I am a careful man," he said. "Yes," she said and leaned into him, and he held her in the April light. Summer came in full, hot and long and full of work, and the farm flourished in the way farms flourish when they are well attended, the east field coming up green and thick. The south garden Sharamph had planted, producing herbs and vegetables in abundance, the animals fat and content, the barn roof solid. Owen found himself waking each morning with the particular feeling of a man who has something to look forward to, which was not a feeling he had expected to find again at 31 years old on a frontier homestead with mountains at his back. There were still difficulties. Tom Birch, his nearest neighbor, came by in June with his wife to look at the new fencing Owen had done on the north boundary that bordered both their properties. And the meeting with Sharamph was awkward in the way that meetings between people of differing experience are always awkward at first. But Tom Birch was, as Owen had told her months ago, a reasonable man, and his wife, Edna, was more than reasonable. She was curious and direct, the kind of woman who asks the questions others will only think. And after 2 hours in the kitchen over tea, she had determined that Sharamph knew more about herb cultivation than anyone she had met, and arranged to come back the following week to look at the garden. After they left, Sharamph stood at the kitchen window watching the Birch wagon go down the lane. "She will come back," Owen said. "I think so," Sharamph said. There was something careful and wondering in her voice, the tone of a person who has not had much practice receiving ordinary kindness and is not yet sure how to hold it. "The world is not all Horace Dent," Owen said. "No," she said. "I'm beginning to see that." In July, a letter came. It came with the trading post rider who came through once a month, a young man who left the mail in a box at the gate without getting off his horse, which suited most people in the outlying farms fine. Owen recognized the script on the outside immediately. It was the cramped, angular writing of the Orc Eastern dialect, and it was addressed to Sharamph. He brought it to her without opening it, which she noted with a small nod that was itself a kind of trust acknowledged. She opened it at the kitchen table while he worked at the far end of the room, and he tried not to watch her read it, and then she said his name and he turned around. Her face was composed, but it had the particular composure of effort rather than ease. "It is from my brother," she said. "Rorug. He is the only one in the clan who—" She stopped. Started again. "He says the chief is dead. A fever last winter. The new chief is Morag, who is Rorug's age and more moderate. There may be a possibility that the exile is reversed." Owen was still. "He asks if I want to come home," she said. He sat down across from her at the kitchen table. Outside, the summer afternoon was golden and full of the sound of insects, and somewhere in the east field the goat was making noise about something. "Do you?" he said. She set the letter down flat on the table and looked at him. There was so much in her face in that moment. The grief of exile, the memory of everything she had been before she walked up to his fence post out of options, the complexity of belonging to a people and a place that had expelled you, and underneath all of it the thing she had built here, in this house, in this room, in this ordinary, extraordinary life. "This is my home," she said. He reached across the table and took both her hands. "Then it stays that way," he said. "But if you want to write back to Rorug, I think you should. You would not object. He's your brother," he said. "A good one by the sound of it." She looked at their hands together on the table, her green gold, large and strong, his darker from the summer sun, calloused in different places, and he watched something in her relax that he had not known was still held. "Yes," she said. "I will write to him." She did that evening at the kitchen table with the lamp burning and Owen reading across from her, and the scratch of her pen on the paper was a comfortable sound in the quiet house, and he thought about the spare room at the end of the hall, which nobody had called a spare room in some time. It had become her room, and he knew, without having said it yet, that it would eventually, if she was willing, not need to be a separate room at all. He asked her at harvest time. He asked her the way he did things, without ceremony or performance, in the middle of ordinary life. They were in the orchard, the small apple orchard along the east fence where he had been meaning to do a proper harvest for 3 years and had not, and she was up in one of the trees passing apples down to him, and he was setting them carefully in the basket, and the light was amber and long and the air smelled of ripe fruit and the turned earth of the fields. "I'd like you to stay," he said, "permanently. Not as hired help." As he paused, he was better with actions than words always had been. "I am asking you to marry me." She passed down an apple. He took it. Then she looked down at him from the branch with those amber eyes, and he looked back up at her, standing with an apple in his hand in the orchard light. "Owen Hayes," she said slowly, "you are asking an orc woman to marry you." "I am asking Sharamph Ironblood to marry me," he said, "which is a specific and different thing." She was quiet for a moment. A bird called somewhere in the tree line. The apple was cool in his palm. "Yes," she said. He helped her down from the tree, and he held her in the orchard, her chin over his shoulder and his arms around her, and neither of them said anything for a long time because there was nothing else to say. They were married in October, 1 year and a few weeks after she had come around the bend in the wagon trail and braced herself against his fence post. The ceremony was small. Tom and Edna Birch were there, and the traveling clergyman who came through the frontier settlements once in the autumn, and unexpectedly, Rorug Ironblood, who had ridden west alone on hearing from his sister's letter, and who arrived on the morning of the wedding looking road-weary and uncertain, and who looked at Owen with the measuring gaze that brothers give to men who are marrying their sisters, and then shook his hand firmly and said, in careful human tongue, that he was glad she had found a person worth finding. Owen shook back just as firmly and said, "So am I." The ceremony was in the yard, under the apple trees that had lost their fruit and were beginning to turn gold at the leaf edges, and Edna Birch cried, which she would deny later, and the clergyman did his words. And Owen took Sharamph's hands in his and made the promises that mattered. And she made hers back with that clear, precise voice that did not say things it did not mean, and he believed every word of it with his whole body. Rorug stayed for a week and then rode east again, and his parting from Sharamph was quiet and dignified in the way orc farewells seemed to be. A long grip of the hands and words said in their own tongue that Owen did not understand but felt, in the way you feel things said in a language that is not yours. The first winter of their marriage was the warmest Owen had spent in that house in a long time, not because the season was gentle, but because the house itself was different. She had transformed it, not dramatically, not by changing things that did not need changing, but by adding to it. The herb jars on the kitchen shelf, the curtain in the spare room which was now simply the room they shared together, the rug she had woven through the long evenings of autumn that lay before the fireplace and caught the light in patterns that made him think of the eastern ranges she had told him about. The house felt inhabited by two people in a way it had not felt inhabited by even one in the 3 years after Clara. He thought about Clara sometimes and did not hide it from Sharamph, and she did not ask him to. She understood, in that precise and unhurried way she understood most things, that a person can be fully present in one life while still carrying the losses of the one before, and that this was not a division of heart but a fullness of it. He found her, one evening in that first winter, sitting at the kitchen table with the quilt across her lap, Clara's quilt, mending a small tear that had opened at one corner. The needle moved through the fabric with careful precision, each stitch exactly matched to the original, the thread chosen to blend with the yellow and blue squares. He stood in the doorway and watched her work, and felt something move through him that was grief and gratitude and love all at once, inextricably wound together. She looked up and saw him looking. "I hope this is all right," she said. "It's more than all right," he said. She went back to the mending. He came and sat beside her and watched her work, and after a while he put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned against him, and they sat like that while the fire burned and the needle moved through the fabric. Spring came again, and with it something they had not expected so soon but welcomed with a warmth that surprised Owen in its depth. Sharamph was expecting a child. She told him in the way she told him everything directly at the kitchen table with the lamp between them. "You are going to be a father," she said. He sat very still for a moment. "Are you?" he started. "Are you well? Is everything is fine," she said with a small smile at his tumble of questions. "I am healthy and strong, and the child will be too." He reached across the table and took her hand. "A child," he said. He said it again. "Our child." "Yes," she said. "Half orc. Half human. The frontier may have opinions about that." "The frontier will manage," he said and squeezed her hand. The frontier did, in fact, have opinions, because the frontier always did. And Edna Birch's warm congratulations and Rorug's pleased letter from the east were balanced by the renewed cold shoulder from Hestwick that they received on a supply run in May when Sharamph's condition had become visible. But Owen drove the wagon with his back straight, and Sharamph sat beside him with her chin level, and they did their business and went home, and neither of them gave the cold shoulder more weight than it deserved. Horace Dent had, in fact, been notably quieter since the confrontation in April of the previous year. Owen did not know why and did not inquire, but Tom Birch mentioned in passing one afternoon that Horace's eldest daughter had become fast friends with a half-elf girl from the settlement at Milford, and that this experience had done something to Horace's firmly held convictions that no argument had managed to do. Owen thought that was about right. It was always the specific person that did it, never the argument. The pregnancy was not easy, because half-orc children are not always easy on the body carrying them, and there were hard weeks and nights that Owen spent sitting up with her and being as useful as he knew how to be, which was not always as useful as he wished. But she was strong, as she had told him, and she came through it with that same steady endurance she brought to everything difficult. And in the early autumn, a year and some months after their wedding, nearly 2 years since she had braced herself against his fence post, Their son was born. He was born in their room with Edna Birch as midwife on a clear September morning, and when Owen first held him, his hands were not quite steady. The boy was small and fierce-looking, and had Sharamph's amber eyes and the beginning of the faintest green tint to his skin that would probably deepen as he grew, and the most infinitesimal suggestion of lower tusks that would become more apparent in time. He was the most extraordinary thing Owen Hayes had ever seen. "He needs a name," Sharamph said from the bed, watching Owen's face with those patient amber eyes. "What do you want?" Owen said. "For a name." She was quiet for a moment. In the clan tradition, a firstborn son carries the name of something enduring, something that will be there when the child is grown. Owen looked at his son, looked at the mountains through the window, looked at the woman in the bed who had come out of nowhere with blood on her temple and dignity in her spine and had changed everything. "Aldous," he said. He paused. "It was my neighbor's name, a good man, and it means something to me about enduring." Sharamph looked at the boy, then back at Owen. "Aldous Ironblood Hayes," she said. "The joining of names, two families made one." "Aldous Ironblood Hayes," Owen agreed. Edna Birch wiped her eyes again, which she would also deny later. The years that followed were ordinary in all the ways that matter and extraordinary in all the ways that accumulate into a life. Aldous grew from a small, fierce infant into a small, fierce child with his mother's directness and his father's patience, which was an interesting combination, and then into a boy who was tall for his age and slightly green and slightly tusked and entirely comfortable with all of it, who helped in the fields from the time he could lift a small basket, and had his mother's gift for fixing things and his father's gift for growing them. Rorug came west again when Aldous was 3, and stayed for a month, and taught the boy words in the Orc tongue that Sharamph supplemented with more systematic teaching, once she saw how eagerly Aldous absorbed them. By the time the boy was 5, he moved between the two languages with the easy fluency of someone for whom both had always been present, which Owen thought was among the finest things he had ever witnessed. Tom Birch's children played with Aldous without a moment's hesitation, which was the best kind of frontier education anyone could provide, and by the time Aldous started appearing at the Hestwick market with his father on supply runs, green-tinted and amber-eyed and perfectly comfortable answering questions in 2 languages, even Hestwick had begun to adjust its opinions, slowly, the way the frontier adjusts anything, through the accumulation of ordinary days in which nothing catastrophic occurred. 3 years after Aldous, they had a daughter. She arrived in a summer so hot the meadow grass went brown, and she was born with a full head of black hair like her mother and Owen's darker coloring in her skin, and her eyes were initially dark and became, over the first months, a changeable color that was neither amber nor dark brown but something between. She was gentler than Aldous from the start, which was not to say soft. No child of Owen Hayes and Sharamph Ironblood was going to be soft, but where Aldous met the world head-on, she approached it sideways, with observation and patience, and then a sudden decisive action that surprised everyone. They named her Mara, which Owen had kept in his heart since long before she existed because it had been his mother's name, and Sharamph added Stonekeep as a middle name, which was the Orc tradition for a daughter, the name of something that holds. Mara Stonekeep Ironblood Hayes. The farm held them all. Owen expanded the house over the years, a proper addition on the east side with 2 rooms for the children, a larger kitchen because a larger family needed it, and eventually the porch that Clara had told him to build, finally built properly, running along the whole south face of the house where you could sit in the evening and watch the sun go down behind the Coldthorn Mountains and feel the end of the day settle around you like something good. Sharamph put a bench on that porch, built by her own hands from the same straight-grained oak she had used for the bed she had made Aldous when he outgrew the crib. She put it facing west, toward the mountains and the last light. Owen came home from the far field one evening to find her sitting on it with Mara asleep against her side, a book open on Sharamph's knee that she was not reading, just sitting in the evening light with her daughter against her, looking at the mountains. He stood at the edge of the yard and watched them and felt the fullness of it move through him like a tide. This woman, this life, this farm that had been a cold and silent place, and was now full of all of it. The mess and the joy and the children and the ordinary miraculous fact of not being alone anymore. She must have heard him because she turned her head, and when she saw him she held out her hand, the way she always did, without words, just the open hand. He crossed the yard and took it and sat down on the bench beside her, and Mara shifted in sleep and made a small sound and settled again, and the mountains caught the last gold of the day and held it for a moment before the dark began to come. "You are thinking something," Sharamph said. "I'm thinking a lot of things," he said. "Most of them about being very grateful." She leaned her head against his shoulder. He pressed his lips to her hair. "I came to your fence post and asked for water," she said quietly, as if she was thinking it through again from the beginning. "You said you could pay for it," he said. "I had 3 coins. I know." She laced her fingers through his. "I did not think it would be this." "No," he said. "Neither did I. Is that all right?" He laughed softly, not wanting to wake the girl. "It is so far past all right I do not have a word for it." She was quiet for a moment. The first star was coming up over the eastern ridge, which was a habit the night had that Owen had always appreciated. "The room," she said. "You called it a spare room." "I did. You said it did not get used." That was true at the time. She tilted her head to look up at him, those amber eyes catching the last light. "And now?" He looked at the house behind them, the light in the kitchen window, the sound of Aldous inside doing something that involved more noise than it probably should, the porch they sat on with the bench she had built. The room at the end of the hall, which had Clara's quilt and Sharamph's dark wool curtain, and the wash basin he had replaced, and the herb jars she kept on the windowsill, which was not a spare room anymore and had not been a spare room in a very long time. "Now," he said, "it is the most used room I have." She made a small sound against his shoulder that was not quite a laugh and not quite something else, but was warm, deeply warm, the sound of a person who has come a very long way and arrived somewhere real. "Sharamph," he said. "Owen," she said, in the same tone as always, the tone that meant, "I hear you, I am here, I am not going anywhere." He put his arm around her and around the sleeping child between them, and looked at the stars coming out over the Coldthorn Ridge, the same mountains that had been there when his great-grandfather built the first walls of this homestead, and that would be there when Aldous and Mara were the ages he was now. And he thought that this was the thing about the frontier. It was hard and it was cold, and it did not apologize for itself. But if you stayed long enough and worked hard enough and kept your heart open in the ways that mattered, it gave you things that could not be taken back. He had given her a spare room. She had given him back everything he thought he had lost: the warmth of the house, the fullness of the table, the sound of laughter in the rooms, the particular peace of lying beside someone in the dark and knowing you are both exactly where you should be. And the children had not called it a spare room for years. They called it home, the way children call things what they are, without calculation or qualification, with the pure and devastating accuracy of people who have not yet learned to say things they do not mean. Aldous called it home when he came running in from the field. Mara called it home when she woke from nightmares and needed the lamp lit. Rorug, on his 3rd visit, called it family in 2 languages and both times got it right. The spare room was hers. The house was theirs. The life was something Owen Hayes had not had the imagination to build for himself, which was why the frontier had sent him Sharamph Ironblood on a Tuesday morning in October, walking along his fence post with 3 coins and her chin level. He had been slow to recognize all of it, he knew. She had told him so, in the apple orchard, with a certain affectionate precision. He was a careful man, and she had been patient with his carefulness, and he had been patient with her wariness, and between the 2 of them, they had built something that did not require anything extraordinary to maintain. Only the daily choosing of it, the daily showing up, the ordinary faithfulness that was more enduring than anything dramatic could be. On the last warm evening of that autumn, when the children were asleep and the house was quiet, he took her hand and led her out to the porch, and they sat together on her bench in the dark, the mountains a shape against the stars, the creek running somewhere in the distance, the farm settled around them like a presence. "Do you remember," he said, "what you asked me that first day? I asked for water," she said, "and I gave it to you." "Yes," she said. "Sharamph." He turned to look at her face in the dark, which he could see by now without needing light. He knew it so well. "I have never done anything smarter in my life than open that gate." She looked back at him, and in the dark her amber eyes still caught whatever light there was, the way amber does, the way it holds light because it was made from something that once was warm. "And I have never done anything smarter," she said, "than come through it." He kissed her then, slowly and completely, in the way of people who have been kissing each other long enough that the urgency has become something richer than urgency, something that knows it has time, that has learned to take the time, that understands the value of a moment deeply enough to stay inside it. She kissed him back in the same way, her hand against his jaw, and the stars over the Coldthorn Mountains did what stars do, which is to say nothing and mean everything. Inside the house, behind a window with a dark wool curtain, the lamp in what had once been called the spare room burned with a warm and steady light that you could see from the lane, from the field, from anywhere on the farm if you looked back at it, a light that said someone lives here, someone is home. The cold outside is not the whole story. Owen had put the lamp in that room 3 years ago so she would have light when she woke in the night and did not know where she was. He had forgotten to take it back. He was glad. In the spring, the last spring of the story, though not the last spring of their lives, which continued with the ordinary fullness of lives well made, Aldous brought a girl home from the Birch farm. A red-haired human girl named Bess who looked at Aldous with the kind of uncomplicated certainty that is both terrifying and wonderful to witness, and looked at Sharamph and Owen across the kitchen table with something that was not quite nervousness, but was in the vicinity of hope. Owen watched Sharamph pour the girl a cup of tea and ask her, with genuine interest, whether she preferred the work of the fields or the work of the animals, and watched the girl's shoulders come down from around her ears as she realized she was not going to be judged, and was simply going to be asked questions by a woman who listened to the answers. He caught Sharamph's eye across the kitchen and she caught his, and something passed between them that was so old and so lived in by now that it did not need a name. Mara, at the table with a bowl of porridge and a book, did not look up, but the corner of her mouth curved in the way that meant she had noticed everything. Later, when the girl had gone back to the Birch farm and Aldous had gone to the barn with the studied casualness of a young man trying not to appear too affected by anything, and Mara had gone to bed, Owen sat at the kitchen table with Sharamph and the lamp between them, the same lamp on the same table, the same chairs worn smooth by years of occupation. She was braiding the end of her hair the way she did in the evenings, the thick black braid secured with a bit of cord, and he was looking at nothing in particular and thinking about everything in general. "Bess," he said. "She is good," Sharamph said. "She listens. You noticed that in 20 minutes." "I noticed quickly," she said, without looking up from the braid. "You took months." "I was thorough," he said. She looked up at him, and the lamp lit her face, and he was 37 years old and she was 34, and they had 2 children and 12 years of this land and this house and each other, and he was, he reflected, the most fortunate man between the Coldthorn Mountains and the sea. "I love you," he said, because he always said it at the moments when he felt it most, which was the policy of a man who had learned not to assume. "I love you," she said, in the same breath with the same simplicity, and went back to the braid. Outside, the spring night was still cool, the last edge of winter in it, and the mountains were a dark shape at the edge of the world, and the creek was running free, and the spare room at the end of the hall was dark because nobody used it for sleeping anymore. only for storage of harness leather and tools, and one quilt with blue and yellow squares that had been mended with careful, precise stitches that matched the original exactly, and which was brought out every autumn and put on the bed. Because it was made to be used, Clara would have liked knowing someone kept warm with it. Owen was quite sure of that. He was quite sure of all of it. The fence and the gate and the water and the bread, the east field and the barn roof and the winter kitchen and the firelight and the kiss and the hay smell, the curtain and the quilt and the apple orchard and the yes, the wedding and the bench and the children with their two-language lives, all of it accumulating into the single undeniable fact of a good life, a full life, the kind that does not happen to careful men who keep to themselves and mind their own business. Except when it does, when the road delivers the right person to the fence post at the right moment, and the man has the sense, for once, to put down his mallet and open the gate. He had opened the gate. Everything else had followed.